Hi everyone. Well, last session of the day, and we're competing with James Cameron from Etri in the other theatre, so no pressure. Right, so today we're talking about where Web 2 and Web 3 collide. Very, very broad topic. So we thought we will sort of zoom in a little bit and talk about DAOs and where DAOs cross over between Web 2 and Web 3. So my name is Leah Dashkina. I am with Reinventure, which is a venture capital fund that invests predominantly in FinTech, but also some adjacencies, which include blockchain. We've got Jeremy and Ellie today, and I'll get them to introduce themselves before we dive in. Ellie, do you want to go first?
Yes, sure. I'm a professor in the RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub. Most of my research involves ethnography, which means I'm embedded in these protocols and communities, and that's how I understand them.
So Jeremy Balding, I am not a professor. My background, I've come from financial markets, so I'm used to operating in very regulated environments. I've been in this space for 4 weeks, so you're probably looking at the bookends for our experience in the sector.
Right, so DAOs, Decentralized Autonomous Organizations. Very good fit for a decentralized world of Web 3, but they are now sort of spilling over into the world of Web 2. And that's what we wanted to discuss today, and sort of how they fit in or not fit in, what are the use cases, and from Jeremy's perspective also how the wholesale investor might consider DAOs and look at them. So if we start from the beginning, sort of, could we have a quick recap of how it started and how it's going? Ellie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, from a very top-level perspective, I think where Web 2 and Web 3 collide is at the intersection of probably innovation and competition. So Web 2, as we know it, it kind of tends towards monopolies at the platform level. It involves harvesting a lot of consumer data and the like, whereas Web 3 is, I suppose, multiplicitous. It's composable. You have various communities and applications bubble up as needed and required, and in a permissionless form. So they're kind of two polar opposites. In some ways, I think we also have polar opposites on this panel here, arguing for and against in a way. But what I mean by innovation and competition in this respect is I think it's really important. I just want to set the stage to say that we need to find a way to advance DAOs and decentralized protocols and the applications upon them in a way that in fact enables them to put pressure on Web 2 because they succeed at different margins. Web 2 has had decades of advantage in terms of usability and how it kind of brings people into its literally web, whereas Web 3, as we know, is trying to do things in a trustless way. The last two sessions, I think, kind of encapsulated this wonderfully, where we had, 2 sessions ago, someone asked about public trust. And one of the panelists said, well, it's you say what you do and then you do what you say. And then in the last session, we just had a discussion around smart contracts and this idea of kind of automation and assurance through the ability to create software that executes when certain, say, votes or whatever it might be, outside data points are met. So we've got two absolute polar opposites in terms of what we mean by the web when we're talking about Web 2 and Web 3. But before we move on, I just want to do one thing, which is who wants me to raise hand, who would like me to try to define decentralized autonomous organization before we go any further? Okay, there's a couple of people. Okay, so a decentralized autonomous organization, or a DAO, is essentially a group of people coming together and performing tasks, for instance, something like governance inside a company, corporate governance, through the use of these smart contracts and other software capabilities. So people can come together from any jurisdiction. They can be pseudonymous, they might not be known to each other, but they can rely on these smart contracts to perform certain functions. So they don't. So one explanation that I've heard, which is quite popular, is you could think of it as a subreddit with a treasury. So how do people in that subreddit actually know if everyone else in that subreddit is going to do what they say when it, say, comes to spending? Well, you can do that because the smart contract provides you with the ability to. So that's kind of a very basic description of a DAO. But as we're going to talk about, that raises a whole lot of issues around corporate governance and compliance and how that fits in with the external world.
Yeah, and I guess to respond, so from my perspective, having spent my entire career working in a heavily regulated environment with a lot of rules and structures to ensure trust, and even now within the, the business that I work in now, so DigitalX, we're a FinTech company, we have blockchain consulting, we have a RegTech arm, and we also have the funds business. But even still within the funds business, to ensure we fit within the regulations, there's certain things that we need to do, which we're ultimately centralising the decision making, we're centralising the custody, we're doing as much as we possibly can to ensure that we fit within the structures that are currently in place, to ensure that we give, the safety and security to the investors. So the funds that we look at are wholesale up, so anywhere from wholesale to family office, all the way up to institutional. So we're certainly open to the idea of going towards that model if we could find a way to get comfortable and get investors comfortable with it. But right now, the regulations require we act in more, I guess you'd call it a Web 2 way rather than Web 3.
And I guess just to add to Ellie's point, a good way to describe that I've come across is a DAO is like a co-op. So a cooperative that forms around either a particular topic or a goal or maybe purchasing an asset. And we see a lot of the protocols are run through a DAO structure. There are community DAOs. There are now also service DAOs, which are formed around a particular profession maybe. So if you're providing services in Web3 marketing, for example, you might operate as a DAO. And there's not one centralized entity that makes the decisions, but in its purest form, I guess it's decision by committee. Right, so from the wholesale investor's perspective, Jeremy, obviously DAO is a really good form for a decentralized world, but institutional and wholesale investors don't necessarily like or can't necessarily play within decentralized pure play situation. So how do you find that they look at that? How do they think about it? Is it of interest? Could you talk a little bit around that?
Yeah, so look, the short answer is right now they're not there. And I think there's a lot of, again, going back to the structures, there's insurance, there's KYC, there's AML. There's a whole lot of reasons that they can't get comfortable with it. Not to say that it won't happen at some point in the near future. But right now, I think the appetite's pretty low, sort of very low.
And Ellie, anything you would like to add there? I think we spoke a little bit the other day about governance in DAOs and that being a barrier for institutionals as well.
Yeah, look, I think that DAO governance via a DAO, and look, the reason why we would need governance via a DAO over something like a decentralized exchange is it's actually not decentralized if you then have a corporate entity located in whatever jurisdiction who is ultimately making decisions. You need decentralization at the governance layer, or at least a kind of ability for people who have a stake in this, in whatever that protocol or product or community or syndicate or whatever it is that the DAO is representing or that the DAO is. So you need these kind of decentralized means of coordination, which is what the DAO is for. So just to be clear there. But these are very, very new in governance world. And there have been some major problems that we've seen. For instance, say you receive a token drop from a decentralized exchange like Uniswap, and suddenly you actually have governance power within this system. And this is exactly what Uniswap did. Anyone who had used their exchange received tokens which gave them governance rights. And you would then be able to vote on various decisions that were, you could propose decisions if you had enough tokens. That was controversial in Uniswap because in fact venture capitalists owned most of the tokens, which we can come to later. And you required a lot to be able to have to meet that threshold. But you are essentially a governor of the web infrastructures that you're interacting with in this instance. You can choose not to accept those tokens, and perhaps then you are not liable. But we don't actually know that under law yet. But this kind of one token, one vote system that's developed has had quite a few problems. So there's this issue of plutocracy, which is where those with the most tokens have significant amount of power. And also, you could take out a loan on a DeFi app, for instance, that would enable you to do a governance attack on that protocol and change the vote in your favour. So what we've seen, and the work that I've been doing with many other researchers and big brains in the blockchain world, are trying to figure out what do we need to do to make governance work in this way. So some of the things might involve systems such as commitment voting, where you actually have to lock away your tokens in order to be able to vote. The longer they're locked away, the more voting power you have, for instance. That would overcome the problem that I've just discussed. But probably the biggest problem that DAOs face with governance is that actually most people don't want to participate and they don't want to have that responsibility or pay attention to every decision that's going on in every Web3 infrastructure that they interact with. So where we're seeing DAO governance evolve at the moment is to say things like sub-DAOs or nested DAOs, where it's more like having a committee structure where you would have experts in a certain topic being able to carry decisions which might then just be kind of finalised by a broader membership similar to other corporate governance systems. So there's a lot of risk in DAOs because they haven't quite sorted it out. But I think the kind of bigger question really that we're facing now is how do we map things which are really good about DAO governance into the laws of countries all around the world, so that those things can kind of be allowed to occur. So just to give an example of that, for instance, when we heard it in the last panel, there's a kind of transparency to tokenized voting in the same way that there might be to tokenized assets, that gives us an ability to know what's occurring within this particular entity. And that actually should be able to meet the requirements, the legal requirements around publicity that regular corporations are required to meet. An account, a DAO has an account. So it is kind of identifiable. It's registered in the same way as a corporation, but the law doesn't actually see that at the moment. So a lot of the stuff that we're looking at the moment as a research field is this kind of equivalence. So rather than say let's make a new version of the Corporations Act, that includes this thing that is a DAO. How do we just say this is what a DAO is, and this is how it actually fits into the existing laws and expectations in the world? It's a fantastic report by a group called Koala with a C, Primavera de Filippi, who was main author on that's coming out to RMIT at the end of the year to help try and bring this into fruition here, because it was mentioned in the Bragg inquiry into what was it, Australia's future as a digital something or other. Basically, the kind of ended up being like the blockchain inquiry last year, yeah.
So Jeremy, to kind of bridge the gap, what needs to happen? What kind of hybrid structures would need to look like in order for DAOs to kind of come to the forefront and for the wholesale investor or for institutional investor to be able to participate in that space?
Yeah, I think it just needs to iterate somewhere from Web 2 to Web 3 and incorporate. So if you were to incorporate a DAO, I still, unfortunately, there still have to be some level of centralization within the process. So let's say, for example, if I use the lens of an investment DAO, because that's sort of what I'm here to talk about, rather than all the decisions being made by one centralized party, you could set up a structure whereby, let's say, for example, the investment team that has the skills and the analytic capabilities to, almost vet a certain subset of securities or tokens that would then be released into the DAO, and then potentially people could then vote on what is a predetermined subset of securities that you've put a pass, fail, put a rating on. They could then make that decision whether or not to split off a certain component of that and run that as their own portfolio, or run their own portfolio based on that. But I just think unless it's an index type structure where it's, you're replicating in the top 100, if it goes to the level where you've got discretion and you're doing some work behind it, I think you sort of still need investment professionals in the process just to help guide it. Like, this may be the first step. I don't think this is probably the end, but I think if you're to take one iterative step, that probably goes some way to giving some level of control, some level of skill in the process, and maybe getting investors comfortable with that.
And I guess there's also various open questions around custody and what that looks like, and regulation and what that looks like. Before we go any further, are there any questions from the audience to our panelists or to myself? Please sing out, because we're almost at time. Did I see a question? Oh, yeah, there's one in the front, just over there.
What would you say is, out of existing DAOs, they're not perfect, but the ones are created for specific purposes, what would you say is the most exciting application where DAO works so much better than any other existing traditional structure? Because that's why we're kind of reinventing governance, to make it better. Is there anything that you would single out, this is the type of project and the reasons why it works very well? And then, I don't know if Jeremy has actually the example for the reasons why the current structure would still work in that case, or anything that institutional investor would look at that case saying X, Y, Z reasons why that's still not acceptable for us as a vehicle.
One of my favorite examples was Please a DAO, which was spun up on Twitter over 23 hours. When a video, an animation was released that the artist had decided would raise funds for anti-racism campaigns in the US. And someone tweeted, anyone want to form a DAO to bid on this asset, essentially this NFT. And Please a DAO was formed and ended up purchasing that NFT, and went on to purchase a number of others, and even fractionalized the famous Doge meme, and did doing many other interesting things. I often, this isn't FinTech, but I think one of the most broken industries in the world is the music industry, and there's some fascinating things happening with DAOs and artist collectives, and a project called Song That Owns Itself is one that I love. But again, it's instances where people are trying to coordinate. They don't necessarily know each other, like artists don't necessarily know their fans, but they might want their fans to have a stake in the song because it's the fans who ultimately make that song known in the world, not marketing companies.
Yeah, so I don't want to sound like I'm always coming from the other side, but I sort of am on this one. But look, I'm a 100% believer in Web3. I definitely think it's got a lot of value. There's speed, there's efficiency, there's peer-to-peer, there's a lot of really good things going on. Where it's just at odds with the investment process and investment structures at the moment, because you'd almost want to know, well, you do want to know, you don't want to know who's voting, how is it being voted, is there a voting score, like how are these people assessed on the decisions of what they're doing, how do I assess that as an investment professional? I need time, I need to do some work to make sure that if I'm going to commit, or someone's going to commit money into that, we need to make sure we've done the work on it. And, this is a great example. It's 24 hours, probably too quick for me, like for the process. So does that mean my process needs to be quicker? Well, maybe, but right now it's not.
Yeah, but in that instance, that DAO can't do anything other than what the DAO decides, if they want to buy this meme or that NFT or whatever it might be. But I would also say that in some ways, look, DAOs do need to be able to attract institutional investors and venture capitalists in order, I think, for this to be, for some of these new innovations to grow strong and secure the capital that they require. But at the same time, we need to be really careful that we don't just give in to the kinds of needs that you're talking about, because if we do that, we're sacrificing a lot as well. And we're sacrificing, the permissionlessness nature of what Web3 can offer. We're also in some ways, if we wanted to do things by the book, we would just create private blockchains, distributed ledgers, where they're essentially just consortium structures of people who are all trusted among each other that can see those transactions. But those haven't actually gone very far. The coders, the public want public blockchains. They want these permissionless, censorship-resistant infrastructures on a massive scale. So we need to figure out how to make this work.
Okay, suggestion. So just going back to this iterative approach, so just curious what you think of synthetics and their structure, where instead of everyone gets a vote, but they're voting on the council, and there's certain people, I think it's a group of 7 that get elected to then make those decisions on behalf of the DAO, rather than everyone having an individual vote. So that's a step. Thoughts?
Absolutely. I think synthetics, which, that's Kane Warwick, Australian innovator, a legend really, has been innovating DAO structures, and so they did what's called an exit to community, where they went from having a corporate entity to being fully owned by a DAO, and they do this delegation system where you can delegate your vote. Delegation does work very well, but there's a lot to be ironed out. A lot of, I had a coffee with someone who I delegated my tokens to recently, someone who's very well known in blockchain world. And I said, I delegated my tokens to you. And he said, I never voted in that. It was Gitcoin. He said, I never voted in Gitcoin. And he said, but the problem is there's no term expiry either. They did. So there's still just people who are kind of setting these things up, still need to do a lot of thinking and looking to what we've already learned throughout the history of corporations and firms.
And going back to the original question, I think the DAO structure is not great for every Web3 project, but when it comes to efficiency, so when you need the power of collective, it works really well, or innovation, to your point about synthetics, right? So in some cases, it will work really well. If you need to pull your resources together and buy an asset, that could work really well. I've got friends who are starting DAOs to buy a vintage race car, and they own it as a community because they can't afford it on their own. Joni Pirovic has started LawFi DAO as an innovation experiment in the legal profession to see if you can democratize legal advice and access for Web3 companies to legal advice. So I think in those cases, DAO structures can work really well, but it doesn't say, like for example, for a traditional startup, DAO might not be the best scenario, even in Web3. And going to the point of VCs and investing in DAOs, it makes it a little bit difficult. On the one hand, you're playing in a liquid market, which is great and very different to normally having your capital locked up for years and years. But on the other hand, there's a lot of compliance hurdles, regulatory hurdles that you need to jump through. And it being an unregulated entity or not a recognized legal entity makes it very difficult. Not least that a lot of VCs in Australia specifically are ESVCLPs, which means they're part of a specific tax regime, and I think investing in a DAO kind of doesn't comply with that. So it creates all sorts of advantages and disadvantages, I guess.
I would say, for those who haven't been following Three Arrows Capital, which is what has caused the major downturn in the crypto markets in recent months, that's a really interesting case where they were borrowing money left, right and centre. And in fact, it was the DeFi protocols that came out fine because they are automated over-collateralized loans using smart contracts governed by DAOs. It was the centralized traditional entities like BlockFi that really suffered and many closed. Because this investment in VC company made extremely poor investment decisions by investing in a stupid algorithmic stablecoin, which really should never have existed, but did because crypto's crazy. So, but my point here is that there are, it kind of goes both ways. Like often the points of risk in Web3 are not these decentralized protocols or DAOs. It's these non-transparent corporate entities trying to make a quick buck off your average consumer layperson who follows Twitter, who are also unprotected.
Do we have time for one more, maybe? Any more questions? No? Okay, any closing thoughts, Jeremy, Ellie, before we wrap up?
Yeah, look, I guess my closing thoughts are, from my perspective, I think at least in the short term, we will probably just have to continue as we are, at least from the seat that I sit in. We'll be looking for ways to try and bridge that gap if we can. Talking to as many people as we can, but I just think right now, not only is it, we have a structure to sit inside, there's certainly a lot of institutional investors that still aren't yet even comfortable with the model that we have, let alone going to the next phase. So I just think we sort of need to, make them feel comfortable with where we are now, and then behind the scenes just keep trying to build and iterate closer to where I think it's probably going to go there anyway. Like it's in our future, DAOs one way or another, they'll be there, and so I think we have to work with them.
I actually agree with you. I think things like ETFs are incredibly important. Crypto ETFs, like where you can buy Bitcoin or Ethereum in a more traditional manner, are really important also for consumer protection right now. And financial advisors also need them because financial advisors are not advising people on how to be safe in the crypto world because they legally can't. So there's a whole lot of kind of issues that the traditional system has learnt to deal with and does well. So I'm not saying we don't need that. I think we do. And meanwhile, those of us who like really hard problems will try and work with you to solve them as well.
Great, thanks very much. Let's give a round of applause to our panellists. Thank you.